My name is Ryan Topping. I am Vice President and Academic Dean of Newman Theological College in Edmonton, and we serve the seminary in Edmonton, St. Joseph's. Also, we serve a lot of Catholic school teachers in the area and others who are interested in Catholic formation. I'm very excited to be here at this conference. A fantastic theme. The paper that I was happy to give was on how it is that philosophers can help evangelize. And the main idea that I was trying to communicate is that young people today have been reasoned out of their faith. And those who are invested in the intellectual apostolate need to do their work to help argue them back into it. Now, of course, arguments aren't the only way that someone is going to reinvest themselves in the church or in their faith, but they do have a vital role to play. So, as Catholic intellectuals, I was trying to suggest that there are three things that we can do. The first is to be attentive to themes within culture, to notice, as it were, the fruits that we see hanging before us. So we need to pay attention to Supreme Court challenges. We need to pay attention to trends within popular culture, music, the arts. We need to be good listeners. But we need to do more than that. We also need to look behind these cultural manifestations to see the humanism or the underlying vision of the good that lies behind them. And then beyond that, we need to ask, what is the fundamental view of the human person that is being represented through these humanisms and through these manifestations in culture? And that's really where the philosophical work begins. We need to be more vigorous, I think, in our engagement with alternate anthropologies. In the Catholic view, man is both, a human person is both body and spirit. We are neither angels nor are we simply beasts. And in fact, we are, as embodied persons, we are destined for a supernatural end. So we really have a wonderful message to convey, and I'm very grateful for the conference organizers, to them, for putting this wonderful event together. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for the introduction and for giving me the opportunity to share a few ideas and reflections with you on our wonderful theme. And I am aware that I am now the last man standing between you and wine. I won't go over time. I can promise you that. The question that I'd like to ask is, how is it that philosophers and theologians can help evangelize? And I'm going to propose that there are three things we can do. And even if you're not a theologian, but someone interested in the intellectual apostolate, you too can do these three things. The first is that we can start by being astute observers of culture. Canada is Christian, and Canada is post-Christian. And these two qualities often coexist in very contradictory and surprising ways. So on the one hand, Canada is still very much Christian. My wife and I and a few of our children lived in the United Kingdom for a number of years. And during that time, my wife was a school teacher. Now, England is old and England is beautiful, but when the pubs open up, England becomes rather rowdy, as you might know. We lived in a tougher part of town, and we regularly used to quarrel with sometimes threatening teenagers, as, for example, one time when we were coming back from a party at the university. It was a Friday night, about 9:30 or so. And 1 out of 20 of these teenagers came up to my wife's bicycle and the basket and stole her slippers. This led to a very disruptive Friday night. When we returned home, we were overwhelmed by how nice most Canadians are, including most Canadian teenagers. Compared to other countries, we Canadians are amazingly good at being polite. Not the rugged peaks of virtue, clearly, but a social grace that can lead you to the foothills. This native deference, this desire not to impose oneself on another, this hospitality even towards diversity is not merely a trite postmodern affectation, I think. Our country carries a long history of peacemaking, beginning with the 1774 Quebec Act, which allowed both Catholics and Protestants to serve the king and their consciences. So we should praise where praise is due. On the other hand, our culture is now decidedly post-Christian. Consider, for example, the trend to discourage bullying in schools. Well, that's not a bad idea, as is defending human rights. But human rights now for us includes reproductive rights, and discouraging bullying at school is often code for bullying parents at home. We're rightly proud of being generous towards refugees, but at the same time we tolerate doctors who are going to kill their grandparents and ours. Again, in the new manufactured Canada, smoking is really, really bad, but marijuana is okay. Post-Christian Canada has become a morally confusing place. We're like the blind men in the gospel. Our sight is just good enough to see people in the shape of trees, but not much better. We see, but we don't see. We're spiritual, but hardly religious. We're kind, but our kindnesses are mixed with cruelties. So for us who have embraced the intellectual apostolate, we who want to help evangelize the culture, what's next? I think that after observing culture well, we've got two further steps that we can take and we can help others to take. And they are to name its humanisms and then to engage with its anthropologies. So in what follows, what I'd like to do is reflect with you on how those three tasks intermingle. And as an aid to that, what I'd like to do is propose a figure. Think of our common life as a tree. A tree has fruits, it has a trunk, it has roots. The fruits represent outward manifestations of culture. How we dance, how we dine, how we paint, how we pray. These fruits are on the surface, and beyond measuring these outward appearances, though, we need to seek the vital sources to touch the sap, so to speak, that is running through the vine or the trunk. Men and women rarely act without reason, without some vision of the good. And so our task as Christian intellectuals is to name what is that good they're seeking. For instance, when the Supreme Court rules against Christian education, or when Lady Gaga sings her sonorous songs, or when your cousin at Thanksgiving tells you and others that he's leaving his wife and kids, let's say, simple condemnations don't usually help, though we have to do that too now and again. Rather, we need to probe. We need to ask, what is the vision of the good that is making such choices seem sensible? To do that is to name a humanism, the account of the good life which is guiding people's actions. So we've observed culture, we've named a humanism. In these tasks, we Christian intellectuals can rely heavily on the insights of sociologists and historians. But in our next step, the properly philosophical work begins, and that is to engage with anthropologies. We hear a lot about the value of dialogue in our culture, and this is in fact where dialogue in any meaningful sense occurs, at the level of roots. So if we're to evangelize, there needs to be some among us, some in the church, who are devoted to the task of asking what are the presuppositions that are animating the humanisms that are giving rise to these fruits in culture. When we travel down from the fruit to the trunk to dig around the dirt, so to speak, at last here our fingers touch the foundation of this tree we call our common life. And what we'll find here at the base is a theology, a cosmology, or in short, an anthropology, a view of restless man's place in the universe. Is man a clever monkey or a dull angel? Are thoughts determined by stars, or are we free spirits? What do you think? Well, for the Catholic, the answer is none of the above. C.S. Lewis once quipped that good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. And there's no shortage of that in our time. This year marks the anniversary of Humanae Vitae, the 50th anniversary. And since that time, St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body has done much to advance Catholic thinking on sex, love, and the body and marriage. Over the next 50 years, with the ongoing aid of Thomistic psychology, that work will have to be extended clearly, also into the domains of marriage, medicine, and politics, but even more into the realms of art, music, and architecture. We Catholic scholars own the duty and the joy of spreading the news of the Imago Dei. So if we take as our first task the interpretation of culture, where might we today begin to look? Certainly, North American culture over the last 20, 50 years or so has seen radical disruptions. And not all of these have been bad disruptions. Racism today, for example, is everywhere condemned. Even staunch atheists want sustainable stewardship of the environment. 15 years ago, if you're a techie, who could have imagined the glories of the Bluetooth? Not all trends have been corrosive, but some have. For one interested in evangelization, two shifts, I think, stand head and shoulders above all the others. The rise of the nuns, that's N-O-N-E-S, and the fall of vocations. So as an extended illustration, so to speak, of this method of engagement and evangelization I'd like to propose, I'd like us to focus on the first trend, the rise of the nuns. For those in the business of tracking popular culture, this is surely the most astonishing feature of the last generation or so. Sociologists define nuns as those who claim no religious tradition. And their rise has been swift. Around 1960, for example, about 98% of Canadians claimed allegiance either to Catholic or Protestant Christianity, and only 1% claimed none. By the time we got to the 70s, that number rose to 4%. By the time we were at the turn of the millennium, we were at 16%. And today, even though it's true a strong majority, 68% still claim to be Christian of some sort. 1 out of 4 identify with none. And then when you look at millennials, that number rises to 1 out of 3. If the heart has its reasons, as Pascal has said, young people today seem not to be finding them. This loss of faith correlates to other losses worth tallying. Take the discipline of the Sunday obligation. When my parents were young, during the years of Trudeau's long rise to power, mass attendance among English-speaking Catholics fell from 75 to 48%. By the era of Jean Chrétien, that number fell again to 30%. And today, about 19 out of 100 of us Catholics show up to Mass on a Sunday. Take the arts. One of the glories of Western culture is the ways in which Catholic doctrine has ennobled the artist's work. We could think of our own Notre Dame in Montreal, or Bach's B minor Mass, or Michelangelo's Pieta. These and others are enough to make obvious this cultural connection. And yet, since at least the 60s, mainstream European and North American artists, on the whole, have gone out of their way to distance themselves from faith, even to mock religion or desecrate beauty. In the early 20th century, Marcel Duchamp's Urinal was the first, most obvious example of the trend. But today you could think of Tracy Emin's celebrated art show, My Bed. Do you know that one? It's pretty famous. It's a messy bed in the Tate Modern. It was sold recently, I think, for 2.5 million pounds. It's nuts. Boy, I've got 8 kids, it's true. I've got messy beds galore. Maybe a rich man. I need to start taking pictures. Or you could think of Cirque du Soleil's 12-year running Las Vegas extravaganza, Love. Anyone here seen it? Yes? I hear it's good. Ostensibly an encomium to the Beatles, but as others have pointed out, a not so subtle exercise in the mocking of Christian faith. Or lastly, consider the contemporary transhumanism and transgender movements. In government-sanctioned laboratories across the globe, now DNA from us is mingling with DNA from pigs and other non-human creatures, so as to blur the distinction between man and beast. At the same time, in progressive classrooms, boys and girls are being encouraged to blur that distinction between girls and boys. In these and other ways, along with the rise of nuns then, in Canada, we're witnessing a more general flight from what people used to call goodness. Eventually, politics does express culture, and culture inevitably embodies a philosophy of life. So if we, Catholic intellectuals, are going to help convert post-Christian Canada, it seems to me we need to do a better job at naming those philosophies that stand behind these bad expressions. In other words, we need to name and then undermine the humanisms that are opposing our own. This is not easy to do. In the home, in the classroom, in the media, this kind of work is very awkward, to say the least. Consider David. Last summer, this young man returned home from the University of Calgary, let's say. He announced to mom and dad he no longer wanted to join them for Saturday afternoon Mass, and his situation is not unique. Did you know this? That if you're a Christian student these days in high school, and you go to church, and you go to college, 7 out of 10 of you, so okay, 2, 4, 6, 8, so here we are, 10. So out of this group, 7, and you all go to church when you're in grade 12. By the time you go to college, after your second year, 7 of them aren't going to church anymore. Isn't that outstanding? His situation is not unique. But if David's parents want to win him back, by some means, they need to be emboldened to interrogate their son and his decisions, and so must we in our own ways. What good does this young man think he's going to find when nuns leave the church? In other words, what are they looking to discover? Well, frankly, I think they often have no clue what they want. And I have no intent to romanticize doubt. Like some of you, I've spent my life working with college-age students, or my working life. And when you ask one why he or she has stopped going to church, the first reply is usually rather ankle-deep. When a 21-year-old sleeps in on Sunday, it's rarely because he has a problem with the hypostatic union, or because he just can't abide by Chalcedon's definition of Our Lady as Theotokos. No, of course not. Usually the problem lies closer to the hips. Our young man has been drifting a long time. He got entangled, ensnared by pornography since 14. And last year he started living with his girlfriend. And now just somehow St. Joseph's liturgy doesn't seem that interesting. All true enough. Still, as priests, parents, professors, we can't rest content with trite justifications. Young people have been argued out of their faith. And we have to do our job to try to argue them back. Prod a little, or at least prod the more articulate among his friends, and you will get a better answer. You may even hear something eventually that sounds closer to an aspirational statement, maybe something like a manifesto. And this is where philosophy can help. For many of our young people, religion is a crutch, or at least it's seen as a network of institutions working against their happiness. Now, that Enlightenment critique is already old and tired, if you ask me, but it can be helpful now and again to return back to the original formulators of that critique. So to people like Freud, Nietzsche, and the father of postmodernism, Friedrich Nietzsche. And what I'd like to do with you is read an excerpt from a letter that he wrote to his sister while he was at university. In fact, oh yes, I guess I better read it because it's being recorded. All right, I was going to say, could someone else read it? But all right, this is on your sheet. This is handout point number, I think it's 4 or thereabouts. 3? Yes, all right. This is what Nietzsche wrote to his sister. Young lad, do we after all seek peace and pleasure in our inquiries? No, only truth, even if this be the most abhorrent and ugly thing. If we had believed from childhood that all salvation issued from someone other than Jesus, say Muhammad, is it not certain, Elizabeth, that we should have experienced the same blessings? Faith does not offer the least support for a proof of objective truth. So here the ways of men part. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and pleasure, little sis, then go on and believe. But if you want to be a devotee of truth, then inquire. Letter from Bonn, 11 June 1865. Now, Nietzsche wrote this to his sister when he was 21. Hear the tone of urgency, even heroism. Faith is not a guide, it's an illusion. It's not a light, it's a darkness. If you want adventure, if you want daring, if you want to drink from the dregs of all that youth and vigor has to offer, strike out on your own. And Nietzsche offered himself as something of a credible example. Their father, like their uncle and like 2 of their grandfathers, were all Lutheran pastors. And Nietzsche grew up in a reasonably devout environment. I was reading some of his letters to prepare for this, and only a few months before this, he's writing home to his mother and to his sister, railing against the Corpus Christi Day processions that are going on in this German city where he's studying. He thought this low class, has no taste. But by the time he was 20, it seems Nietzsche had already decided that God is dead. Besides drinking too much, he had laid the foundation philosophically for the rest of his life. Rather a premature judgment, one might think. 20 years old? And yet, unfortunately, these early impressions often stick. Rarely do the organs of high and popular culture any longer provide opportunity for our 20-somethings to question their own skeptical faith. And that's what it is, a faith. We need to offer them opportunities. For today's godless faith is weak, doubt is strong, religion a convention, self-expression authentic. The skepticism of the 19th century elites has metastasized itself into the creed of 21st century blogging teens. Now, isn't that odd? Only a fraction of the under 30 crowd in Canada has read Beyond Good and Evil, let's say, and yet a growing throng, even amongst Christian teens, seem to have drunk from that same well. It's almost as though they were fruit from the same vine. So what do those roots look like? Underneath the overgrown brambles of Nietzsche's bloated humanism lies a shriveled anthropology. In Nietzsche's view, freedom is our defining feature. The best lives among us are autonomous, a term worth meditating upon. It was Immanuel Kant who first popularized it, though both Nietzsche and Kant accept it and embrace it. That word, autonomous, comes from two Greek words, auto, the first side, which means self, and then nomos, which means law. So if you're autonomous, you are a legislator for yourself. And a good life, that is to say, one who is living with authenticity, is someone who doesn't listen to anybody else for the generation of their own rules. In fact, if you do, you're living with bad faith, so the story goes. And yet this freedom is formless. It's a flag without colors, a mast without wind, a ship without rudder. Man sails over the sea of time with neither stars to guide nor harbor to welcome him home. Since God is dead, we're told, we must find our way in a cosmos that is nothing better than a chaos, without prayer, without heaven, without good and evil, and without truth. Today, the celebration of such anemic freedom is the theme with 1,000 desperate variations sung by our pop stars, our movie stars, our athletic stars, CEOs, and even some of our teachers. Against such competing visions of man, of the human person and the human good, how can we who are invested in the intellectual apostolate throw back our energies? It seems to me that that's a question, a very searching question that each of us, when we meet the Lord, are going to be asked. And we'll be judged in our own ways, and maybe even collectively. Certainly, dialogue does have its place, but that's not the only mode of cultural engagement. So by way of conclusion, let me propose two others. The first strategy I'd like to call the via positiva. In this mode of cultural engagement, we can show how Catholic anthropology better satisfies our culture's own best interests, its own best instincts. On this front, we could press home how the Imago Dei scores innumerable advantages. In other words, it's going to, and it should resonate with people, with what they already think, or what most of us already think. Our Western faith in reason, in science, in democracy, for example, presumes a Christian view of free and responsible individuals endowed with a divine spark and order to a common good. So the idea is here, if you like limited government, thank the church. If you like penicillin, thank the church. We came up with the universities after all. Islam didn't do it. Asia didn't do it. The Egyptians didn't do it. It was us. If you like Mozart, thank the church. But, of course, not everyone likes Mozart. And not everyone will like this line of appeal, so we need another. Let's call it the via negativa. A more bracing rhetoric might better serve those friends of ours who take, you might say, a narrower view of culture and are not quite alive to the glories of Western civilization. There are some of those out there too. We might show them along these lines how rejecting Christianity leads to many negative consequences, leads to despair. For instance, we need never to tire of pointing out how scientifically reductive accounts of the human person undermines freedom, undermines dignity, beauty, and reason itself. And I think we have a strong case to make. We've got a hook in people's hearts. Why? Because the mind is ordered to know. We can't help ourselves. Intelligence reaches out to grasp the reasons for things. And in fact, to stop looking for universal truth, as Marx, Nietzsche, and friends counsel, is akin to asking a person to stop breathing. Eventually, you grow sick and faint, even as a culture. That's because a head without truth is a heart without hope. A few months ago, I was on a flight from Boston to San Francisco. Just as I was settling into the back corner of the bus, hoping, as one does, that the next seat will stay vacant for the long trip, a young man slid in. And after a few minutes, beside me, after a few minutes, he was watching a video. It wasn't quite pornographic, but it was lewd. It was lewd enough to get my blood boiling. So after 5 minutes, I looked at the chap and I said, "You can't watch that." And this is a little bit awkward because there's nowhere to go. And he looks back at me and says, "Why can't I?" Okay. I say to him, "It's going to wreck your eyes." To which he replies, quite cleverly, I have to say, I don't have glasses, I wish I did, pointing to his glasses, he says to me, "Well, my eyes are already ruined." Clever. That was the beginning of a delightful conversation that we had over the next 3 hours over Ohio, Wyoming, Indiana, and over the mountains into the Bay Area. I came quickly to admire and also to pity this young man. He was a Harvard grad, a single child, a devotee of 20th century art. He had a girlfriend. He had just begun a career as a school teacher, but he had no idea what his life was about. I give him credit, though, because he had more stamina than do most of our professors these days. The main question that we disagreed upon during our debate was whether our senses could map onto the external world. That's kind of a fun one. Every undergraduate, first-year undergraduate wants to talk about that. But more significantly, whether our freedom is oriented towards some purpose or end. Does it have a point? It took only a few minutes, so to speak, before we were entangled at the roots. And I praise him because he was willing to ponder what Nietzsche and many of our nuns rather blithely assume as their premise. Since no truth can be found about religion, your future is yours to forge. You might choose faith, you might not. You might marry, you might not. You might claim your biological sex, you might not. You might prefer kids, or you might settle for a shaved, wrinkled poodle. Clearly, telling a young man like this to have faith would be heard as a counsel to despair. A young person like this, he doesn't need faith. He needs confidence in reason. And for those educated in a secular university, these days, one of the first lessons you'll gain in a humanities class is the following. Truth is not about correspondence. It is not a relation between mens and res, mind and thing. Truth is rather a massed expression for power. In Nietzschean and aligned humanisms, religion's not only false, it's the great enemy of happiness. You know, a recent study revealed, for example, that 55% of Canadians think that religion on the whole is a force for harm in the world. As Christopher Hitchens, one of Nietzsche's contemporary disciples, quipped, believing in God is like voluntarily living in North Korea. He was a journalist. He's clever at that level. And if you think about it, if you accept the premise, that conclusion might follow. If reason cannot discover truths about good and evil, if reason is silent about God, beauty, the soul, if human will is absolute, then all that remains are willed opinions or values. I don't think you should use that word values. It comes from Nietzsche. And it means an expression of your desire that has no relation to reason, even though John Paul did use that word. He tried to use it with a different meaning. That's where it comes from. Or as we say on postmodern campuses, if human reason has no play, then we better look out for microaggressions, because they're everywhere. Brothers and sisters, let us put aside the childish fairy tales of some professors. And as we begin our weekend together, let us call to mind two other papal anniversaries that are in the air. 20 years ago, St. John Paul II published Fides et Ratio. 25 years ago, Veritatis Splendor. Though the first of these is directed towards philosophers and the second toward theologians, they share a common message. This is it. Return to reason. Return to reason. In these texts, the Holy Father called upon us, Catholic intellectuals, to show forth the splendor of truth in all its metaphysical grandeur. And besides the arguments themselves, with St. John Paul, as His Grace well pointed out, we can call upon the great cloud of witnesses, from Socrates to Justin Martyr, to St. Augustine and Thomas and Newman and Sister and Edith Stein, to breathe hope again into young hearts that philosophy need not lead to despair, and that a life devoted to the true, the good, and the beautiful, in fact, is the happiest life of all. Pascal was right when he said, the heart has its own reasons. Faith does need more than philosophy, but faith supposes nothing less. Canadian postmodern culture is a morally confusing place to be, where many of our friends, especially our children, walk blindly. Please God, may our efforts at dialogue, yes, but also at persuasion, help make straight the path of the Lord, who runs to them and also runs to us. Thank you very much.